Ancient Egypt lasted 3,000 years, not because it was invincible, but because it survived things that should have destroyed it. This is the story of a civilization that stood at the edge of total collapse more than once and found a way back. The question is, how close did it actually come? For nearly 3,000 years, we have been told a simple story. Ancient Egypt was eternal. The Nile flooded every summer, right on schedule. The pharaoh ruled by divine order. The harvests came, and the civilization endured, outlasting empires, outlasting centuries, outlasting memory itself. We carved that story into our textbooks and built museums around it. Egypt, of all the ancient world, was the one that did not fall apart. But here's the problem. That stability was not built into Egypt's bones. It was borrowed from the sky. And the sky, it turns out, was never as reliable as the monuments suggest. At the centre of this story is not a pharaoh. It is not a general, a god, or a dynasty. It is a weather system. Thousands of miles to the south, deep in the Ethiopian highlands, seasonal monsoon rains fell every summer and drained northward into the Blue Nile. That water travelled across a continent, swelled the river and flooded Egyptian fields, depositing the fertile black silt that fed every person in the kingdom. The pharaoh did not control the flood. The monsoon did. And then when that monsoon weakened, even fractionally, the consequences reached all the way to the throne. Records show that around 2200 BC, something shifted in the global climate system. A prolonged aridification event spread across the Near East. Sediment cores drilled from ancient lake beds preserve the evidence in layers. Thinner flood deposits, years of reduced silt, the geological signature of a river running low. Meanwhile, on the surface, inscriptions began to change in tone. Officials who had spent careers recording triumphs started recording something else entirely. I gave bread to the hungry, wrote one regional governor, Anktifi of Mo'ala. I fed my entire nome in years of famine. He said it not as boasting, but as survival. The great central government that had built the pyramids, organised labour across the entire Nile Valley and elevated the pharaoh to the status of a living god. That government went quiet. And now, this is not a story about blaming nature for human failure. Climate alone does not collapse civilizations. Egypt had survived dry spells before, but the evidence buried in geology, in ancient texts, in the chemistry of lake sediment and cave formations across 3 continents, all of it points toward the same window of time. And within that window, one of the greatest civilizations in human history came apart at the seams, at the core. And so the questions worth asking are these. How long can a civilization survive when the river it was built around stops rising? When the grain runs out, not for a season, but for years? How does a god-king explain that to his people? And if a pharaoh's divine authority depended on maintaining cosmic order, what happened to that authority when the cosmos refused to cooperate? Tonight we are stepping into the silent years, when the Nile ran low, the granaries emptied, and the most powerful civilization on earth trembled, not because of an army, but because the rains failed to fall. We will follow the evidence from paleoclimate cores to royal tombs, from worker strikes to collapsed dynasties, and we'll find that the story of ancient Egypt is far more fragile and far more extraordinary than any textbook has ever admitted. When most of us picture ancient Egypt, we picture permanence. golden burial masks, limestone monuments still standing after 4,000 years, a civilization so organised it could move 2.5 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons, into near perfect alignment with true north. That image of permanence is real, but permanence has a cost, and Egypt paid it in full more than once, because those same monuments, those very pyramids, stopped being built during one particular century, not because Egypt ran out of ambition or stone, and not because an invading army seized the capital, because the food ran out. Consider what the geological record actually shows. Speleothem cores, mineral deposits extracted from cave formations across East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, preserve isotope ratios that act like a chemical diary of ancient rainfall. The entries around 2200 BC tell the same story from multiple directions. A dramatic, sustained reduction in the monsoon precipitation that fed the Nile system. Simultaneously, Nile flood level records, reconstructed from sediment deposits at Elephantine Island near the First Cataract, show years of abnormally low inundation stacked consecutively. Not one bad year, not two. The kind of consecutive shortfall that depletes every reserve a civilization has. And here is the detail that tends to stop people cold. The Egyptian state's response to this crisis was not incompetence. As the administrative system, one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies the ancient world had ever seen, simply ran out of runway. Grain reserves existed for exactly this kind of emergency. Records show they were used, and then they were gone. At that point, the machinery of divine rule had nothing left to distribute. Tomb inscriptions from provincial officials, men who had been minor administrators in a centralised empire, suddenly read like crisis dispatches. They fed the hungry. They kept order. They buried the dead. They did it themselves, because the capital was no longer capable of doing it for them. The pyramids stopped. The royal court fragmented. The god-king lost the one thing a god-king cannot afford to lose, the trust of a hungry people. But to understand how a civilization this powerful could be brought so low by something as invisible as rainfall patterns, we need to go back further than the drought. We need to go back to the very beginning of Egypt's relationship with its climate, because the story does not start with the pharaohs. It starts with a green Sahara. A green Sahara does not look like the beginning of a catastrophe, but that is exactly what it was. Around 10,000 years ago, the climate of North Africa looked nothing like it does today. The Sahara was not a desert. It was grassland, dotted with shallow lakes, threaded with seasonal rivers, grazed by cattle and gazelles. Rock art preserved in the stone of what is now southern Libya and Chad shows hippos, crocodiles and human figures fishing from boats. The monsoon belt sat far to the north of where it sits today, pushing reliable rainfall deep into the continent. Then gradually it retreated. Orbital cycles, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over tens of thousands of years, shifted the angle of sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. The monsoons followed the heat southward. Lakes dried, grasslands cracked, and the people who had lived across that vast green interior began to move toward the one place that still had water, the Nile. That migration shaped everything. The ancestors of the ancient Egyptians did not choose the Nile Valley because it was comfortable. They chose it because the desert left them no alternative. And in doing so, they built one of history's most extraordinary experiments, a civilization powered almost entirely by a single river. Yet what made the Nile so extraordinary was not just its water, it was its rhythm. Every summer, without fail, or so it seemed, the river rose. It spilled over its banks, flooded the flat farmland on either side, and retreated, leaving behind a thin layer of dark, mineral-rich silt. That silt was the difference between life and starvation. Egyptian farmers did not irrigate in the modern sense. They built low earthen walls to trap the floodwater in shallow basins, let it soak, and let it deposit its load, and then planted directly into the saturated soil. The system was elegant, efficient, and almost entirely dependent on the flood arriving at the right depth. Not too shallow, not so deep it destroyed the fields entirely. A flood measured at Elephantine, near the first cataract of the Nile, determined the harvest months later in the delta. Officials called nilometers recorded the water level each season. Those numbers were not administrative curiosities. They were survival forecasts. But here is what those numbers never showed, because no ancient Egyptian could have known it. The flood did not originate in Egypt. It originated in the Ethiopian highlands, more than 3,000 kilometres to the south, where the summer monsoon dropped enormous quantities of rain onto steep volcanic slopes. That water drained into the Blue Nile, and the Atbara River surged northward and arrived at Egyptian fields months later as the annual inundation. The Black Land, Kemet, as Egyptians called it, was fed by rain that fell in a country that would not be known to Egyptian geographers for centuries. Egypt did not control its own food supply. A weather system it could not see, predict, or influence held that power entirely. The Egyptians understood this dependency, even if they did not understand its mechanics. They wrapped it in theology. The annual flood was the gift of the god Hapi, a deity depicted with a full belly and hanging breasts, as symbolising abundance. The pharaoh's divine mandate, his claim to rule as a living god, was inseparable from his ability to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic principle of balance, order, and rightness that kept the universe functioning. A successful flood was not just good agriculture. It was proof that the king stood in right relationship with the gods, which means a failed flood was not just a poor harvest, it was a theological crisis. For most of Egypt's early history, the floods came. Yet the silt arrived, the grain grew, and the civilization built pyramids, carved temples, and spread its reach across the ancient world, all resting on the assumption that the river would keep its promise. It was a reasonable assumption until it wasn't, because history remembers the pyramids, but it almost forgot the drought. There is a place in the Egyptian desert about 100 kilometres west of Abu Simbel called Nabta Playa. Today it is lifeless, a flat, a cracked basin surrounded by sand and silence. But beginning in the 1970s, archaeologists digging beneath that dry surface found something that did not belong in a desert. The remains of organised human settlements, hearths, storage pits, cattle bones, and standing stones arranged in a circle that some researchers believe track the summer solstice, making it one of the oldest astronomical alignments ever discovered. The people who built it were not lost. They were not passing through. They lived there for generations. Nabta Playa was a lake, not a puddle, a genuine seasonal lake, deep enough to support cattle herds and permanent communities, sitting in a region that today receives almost no rainfall at all. Sediment cores drilled from its lake bed preserve the evidence in layers: organic material, pollen from grasses and shrubs, the chemical signatures of standing water. The record stretches back to around 10,000 BC and holds steady for nearly 5,000 years. This was the African humid period, a climatic era when the entire band of the Sahara received dramatically more rainfall than it does today. Paleoclimate researchers have reconstructed it from dozens of sites across the continent, dried riverbeds in Libya that once carried year-round flow, fossil shorelines of lakes in Chad that were once larger than the Caspian Sea, pollen records from Morocco showing forests where only scrub survives now. The evidence is consistent and specific. The Sahara was not always a desert. It was a savanna, and for thousands of years it was inhabited. The mechanism behind this transformation was not local, it was astronomical. Earth does not orbit the Sun at a fixed angle. Over cycles of roughly 26,000 years, the planet's axis slowly wobbles, a process called orbital precession. Around 10,000 BC, the tilt placed the northern hemisphere in a position that intensified summer solar radiation. The landmass of North Africa heated more strongly than the ocean to the west, creating a pressure differential that pulled the monsoon belt northward, deep into what is now the Sahara. More monsoon meant more rain. More rain meant more grass, more lakes, more life. Then the orbital cycle continued. By around 5000 BC, the tilt had shifted enough that the summer heating weakened. While the pressure differential narrowed, the monsoon belt drifted back south, slowly at first, then with accelerating effect. Lakes shrank, riverbeds went dry between seasons, then permanently. The grasslands thinned, cracked, and surrendered to sand. The process took centuries, but it was irreversible. The people of the Sahara did not simply disappear. Populations that had lived across a vast habitable interior converged on the remaining water sources, and the greatest of these was the Nile. And archaeologists trace this movement in the pottery styles, burial practices, and cattle herding traditions that begin appearing in the Nile Valley during precisely this period of Saharan desiccation. Egypt was not founded despite the desert. It was founded because of it. The desert concentrated people, resources, and eventually power, all along a single narrow corridor of fertility. That concentration made complex civilization possible, and it also made the entire system radically dependent on the one thing that remained, the river. What the paleoclimate record makes clear, and what no ancient Egyptian scribe could have read in a papyrus, is that the climate of North Africa had already changed dramatically once within human memory. The Green Sahara was not myth or legend. It was lived experience, encoded in the migrations of ancestors and the abandoned lake beds of a wetter world. The desert was not a permanent condition, yet it was a direction, and the Nile, for all its apparent reliability, sat at the end of the same long chain of atmospheric forces that had already reshaped an entire continent. The river's generosity was real, but it was never guaranteed. In the sciences that study ancient climate, events are often named for their age. The 4.2 kiloyear event takes its name from when it happened, approximately 4,200 years ago, around 2,200 BC. And it is not a footnote in paleoclimate research. It is one of the most significant and widely documented aridification events of the entire Holocene epoch, the geological period spanning the last 11,700 years of Earth's history. Its fingerprints appear on every continent. The evidence comes from sources that have no reason to agree, and yet they do. Speleothems are mineral formations that grow inside caves, layer by layer, as water drips through limestone over centuries. Because their chemical composition reflects the rainfall conditions above them, they function as precise climate archives. Cores extracted from caves in Oman, China, and the Central United States all record the same anomaly at the same moment, a sharp shift in oxygen isotope ratios indicating sustained reduction in monsoon-driven precipitation, beginning around 2200 BC and lasting for several centuries. Lake bed sediment cores from East Africa show the same signal, where pollen records from the Levant show vegetation collapse during this window. The Dead Sea dropped dramatically in level. The Tigris and Euphrates, fed by the same atmospheric systems that govern the African monsoon, weakened, and at almost precisely this moment, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true imperial state, ruling Mesopotamia from modern-day Iraq, collapsed. Its northern agricultural heartland was abandoned within decades. An archaeological survey of the region found hundreds of settlements simultaneously depopulated, with refugees apparently streaming southward toward remaining water sources. Chronologies indicate this was not a regional drought. It was a global atmospheric reorganization. For Egypt, the mechanism was specific. The Blue Nile's volume depends almost entirely on rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands. When the monsoon weakens over that region, less water enters the system. Less water means a lower inundation, and the margin between a sufficient flood and an insufficient one was narrower than it might appear. Studies of Nile flood level reconstructions show that a reduction of even 15 to 20% in peak flow could mean the difference between a normal harvest and a catastrophic shortfall. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta and from deposits near Elephantine preserve the record of this period in fine detail. The flood layers become thinner. In some years they nearly disappear. The dark, fertile silt that Egyptian agriculture depended on simply stopped arriving in sufficient quantity. One bad flood year was manageable. Egypt maintained grain reserves precisely for that contingency, a system sophisticated enough that administrators tracked storage levels across multiple regional warehouses. 2 consecutive weak floods stretched those reserves. 3 began to empty them. Records from this period suggest the floods failed not for 1 or 2 seasons, but across a span of years, possibly decades. There was no reserve system deep enough to absorb that. The social consequences unfolded in a predictable sequence. When harvests shrank, grain prices rose, and the poorest rural communities, the ones with the least stored surplus and the least access to state redistribution networks, felt it first. Farmers who could not feed their households abandoned their fields and moved. Displaced populations placed pressure on towns and regional centres that were themselves running short. The redistribution networks that held the state together began operating under conditions they were never designed to sustain. Tomb inscriptions from provincial officials of this era begin recording acts of local relief, feeding the hungry, maintaining order during shortage, with a frequency and urgency that stands in sharp contrast to the triumphant records of earlier generations. Something had changed, not in Egypt's ambition, not in its organisation, not in the ability of its people, in the river. For the first time in centuries, the Nile did not obey. Pepi II came to the throne as a child, and by most ancient accounts, ruled for over 90 years, the longest reign in Egyptian history, and possibly in all of recorded history. It should have been a story of extraordinary continuity. Instead, it became the hinge on which an entire era broke. The Old Kingdom, the age that produced the Great Pyramids at Giza, the Sphinx, and the administrative machinery to organise both, had run for nearly 500 years on a model of extreme centralisation. The pharaoh sat at the apex of everything: land, labour, grain, trade, a religious authority. All of it flowed upward toward the throne and back outward through a tightly controlled network of appointed officials. That model worked brilliantly when resources were abundant. When the Nile flooded reliably and the granaries stayed full, the king's claim to divine mandate was self-reinforcing. Order produced prosperity. Prosperity confirmed order. The concept of ma'at, cosmic balance, was not merely philosophical. It was visible, measurable, and politically essential. But the model had a structural vulnerability it had never been forced to confront. It depended entirely on surplus. As the flood failures compounded across years, the state's ability to pay its obligations began to deteriorate. The pyramid-building economy was not vanity. It was a sophisticated labour redistribution system. Workers were fed, housed, and compensated from central stores. When those stores thinned, the capacity to organise mass labour thinned with it. Royal pyramid construction, the most visible measure of centralised power, slowed and then stopped. The last monuments of the 6th dynasty are notably modest compared to what came before. Pepi II's own pyramid complex at Saqqara is smaller and more hastily constructed than those of his predecessors. The ambition was still present. The resources were not. Simultaneously, her provincial governors, the nomarchs who administered Egypt's regional districts, began accumulating power that would previously have flowed to the capital. As central redistribution faltered, local officials became the effective providers of food and stability. Their tomb inscriptions from this period grow longer, more elaborate, and more personally assertive, a contrast to earlier officials who subordinated their identities almost entirely to the king's glory. Anktifi of Mo'ala, a nomarch from the region south of Thebes, left one of the most remarkable autobiographical inscriptions of the era. He described controlling grain distribution across multiple provinces, navigating conflict with neighbouring administrators, and maintaining order during conditions of acute shortage. He presented himself not as a servant of the crown, but as a local saviour, a man who acted because the system above him had ceased to function. And a literary text known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, dated by scholars to a later period, but believed to reference or reflect conditions at the end of the Old Kingdom, describes a world inverted, the poor occupying the houses of the wealthy, social hierarchies dissolved, the land in disorder. Scholars debate its precise historical context and degree of literary exaggeration, but its emotional register matches what the administrative and archaeological records independently suggest. Something had broken, not suddenly, but completely. Trade networks that connected Egypt to Lebanon for cedar timber and to Nubia for gold contracted sharply. The archaeological signature of long-distance exchange simply diminishes across this period. Without surplus, there was nothing to trade and no state capacity to organise the expeditions. What collapsed was not Egypt's population or its geography. It was the idea at Egypt's centre that a divine king, or by virtue of his relationship with the gods, could guarantee order and abundance. When the river failed year after year, that idea became impossible to sustain. Ma'at did not bend, it broke. The pyramids had risen in confidence, but drought brought them to silence. Collapse, when it comes to civilizations, is rarely a single moment. There is no army breaching the walls, no fire visible from a distance, no declaration that the old world has ended and something lesser has taken its place. It is quieter than that, and in many ways harder to see. What followed the breakdown of the Old Kingdom was not chaos in the dramatic sense. It was something more unsettling, a slow, grinding fragmentation, a civilization that kept functioning in pieces while ceasing to function as a whole. Historians call this era the First Intermediate Period, spanning roughly from 2180 BC to 2055 BC. The name is neutral, almost clinical. And the reality it describes was neither. Power did not disappear, it dispersed. The nomarchs who had spent the final decades of the Old Kingdom quietly accumulating local authority now operated as effective rulers of their own territories. Some controlled grain, others controlled river access, a few maintained small armies. The unified administrative system that had once coordinated labour, trade and food distribution across the entire Nile Valley fractured into competing regional centres, each managing its own survival. This produced a particular kind of instability, not the instability of open warfare alone, but of chronic uncertainty. Borders between districts shifted, alliances formed and dissolved. Inscriptions from this period record military skirmishes between neighbouring nomarchs with a matter-of-fact frequency that suggests conflict had become a background condition of ordinary life. The archaeological record of this period is telling precisely because of what it lacks. A monumental tomb construction, the most resource-intensive expression of Egyptian elite culture, effectively ceased. What replaced it was modest, smaller burial chambers, simpler grave goods, coffins painted with religious texts rather than carved from expensive stone. These are not the burials of a culture that had abandoned its beliefs. They are the burials of a culture that could no longer afford its ambitions. Long-distance trade, already contracting at the end of the 6th dynasty, had declined further. The material evidence, Lebanese cedar, Nubian gold, Sinai copper, largely disappears from the archaeological record during this window. Egypt turned inward, not by choice but by necessity. Perhaps the most sobering evidence comes from human remains. Bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal material from this period shows elevated rates of bone lesions and growth disruptions associated with chronic malnutrition, particularly in children. These are not the marks of a single famine season. They are the marks of sustained, years-long nutritional stress written into the bodies of people who survived it. Quiet suffering leaves quiet evidence, but the climate did not stay broken forever. Paleoclimate records suggest that monsoon patterns began gradually stabilising sometime after 2100 BC. The shift was not dramatic. There was no single flood season that announced recovery. It was incremental, season by season, said the river regaining depth, the silt returning in greater quantities, the fields producing enough to begin rebuilding what had been lost. As agricultural conditions improved, the political conditions for reunification slowly returned. Surplus made organisation possible again. Organisation made ambition possible again. Around 2055 BC, a ruler from Thebes named Mentuhotep II completed a military and political campaign that brought the fragmented districts back under a single authority. It took years of sustained effort. But the precondition for his success was not military genius alone. It was the river. When the floods recovered, so did the surplus. And surplus, in Egypt, was always the foundation of power. The first intermediate period did not end because Egypt found a stronger king. It ended because the climate relented. The river returned, and with it order. Civilizations that survive catastrophe do not simply return to what they were. If they are fortunate and perceptive, they return as something harder. Mentuhotep II did not reunify Egypt and then govern it the way the Old Kingdom had. He could not have, even if he wanted to. The administrative assumptions that had made the Old Kingdom function, extreme centralization, surplus taken for granted, divine authority, self-sustaining, had been tested against reality and found insufficient. What the first intermediate period had demonstrated, at enormous human cost, was that a state with no redundancy has no resilience. The Middle Kingdom was built with that lesson embedded in its foundations. The most visible expression of this shift was in how Egypt approached water. Rather than relying almost entirely on the natural basin irrigation system that had served for millennia, trap the flood, let it soak, plant in the silt, Middle Kingdom administrators began investing in infrastructure designed to extend and control water distribution more deliberately. The most ambitious of these projects centered on the Fayum Depression, a large natural basin southwest of Memphis connected to the Nile by a channel called the Bahr Yusuf. Under a series of Middle Kingdom rulers, this channel was deepened and regulated, allowing floodwater to be diverted into the Fayum on a managed schedule. The depression effectively became a reservoir, storing water during high floods and releasing it during low ones, smoothing the variability that had proven so catastrophic a century earlier. The scale of this undertaking was considerable. It required sustained state investment across multiple reigns, precise hydraulic engineering, and a bureaucratic apparatus capable of coordinating labour and resources over decades. Egypt was not simply recovering, it was redesigning itself. And the figure most associated with the Fayum's transformation is Amenemhat III, who ruled during the mid-19th century BC and presided over what many historians consider the administrative and agricultural apex of the Middle Kingdom. Under his reign, the reclamation projects reached their greatest extent. New farmland was brought into production. Nilometer records from his era suggest flood monitoring became more systematic, not merely observational but integrated into state planning. Grain storage systems expanded in parallel. Regional warehouses, which had existed in earlier periods but functioned primarily as collection points, were restructured into a more deliberate buffer network, designed to hold reserves specifically against the possibility of future shortfall. The administrative texts of the Middle Kingdom reflect a bureaucratic culture clearly aware of agricultural risk in a way that Old Kingdom records simply do not. The experience of the first intermediate period had produced something rare in ancient governance: institutional memory of disaster translated into structural precaution. The climate cooperated with these efforts. Flood records reconstructed from sediment deposits indicate that the Middle Kingdom broadly coincided with a period of more stable and sufficient Nile inundations. The catastrophic variability of the late Old Kingdom had, for the time being, receded. Yet this alignment of better infrastructure and more favourable conditions produced genuine prosperity. Trade networks that had contracted during the intermediate period reopened. Expeditions to Sinai, Nubia, and the Levant resumed. Monumental construction returned, not at the scale of Giza, but consistent and sustained. Egypt had learned something the Old Kingdom never had to learn, that the river's reliability was a gift, and not a guarantee, no, and that the distance between stability and ruin was measured not in armies or dynasties, but in flood levels and filled granaries. For now, the granaries were full, but the atmospheric systems that governed the Nile had shifted before. They would shift again. 1,000 years is a long time to hold a civilization together. By around 1200 BC, Egypt had done exactly that, surviving the collapse of the Old Kingdom, rebuilding through the Middle Kingdom, and expanding through the New Kingdom into an empire that stretched from the Sudan to the borders of modern Syria. Its armies were formidable, its temples were stocked, its administrative reach extended further than at any previous point in its history, and yet the same atmospheric forces that had nearly broken Egypt 2,000 years earlier were quietly reorganizing again. The evidence this time comes from an unusually wide array of sources. Or tree ring records from the eastern Mediterranean, preserved in ancient timber from sites across Turkey, Greece, and the Levant, show a pronounced narrowing of growth rings beginning around 1200 BC. Narrow rings mean stress years, drought, cold, or both. The signal persists across multiple decades and appears consistently enough across different locations that researchers treat it as regional rather than local. Pollen cores from lakes in Turkey and the southern Levant record vegetation shifts characteristic of sustained drying, forest species retreating, drought-tolerant scrub expanding. The Dead Sea, whose level responds sensitively to regional precipitation, shows a significant drop during this window. What the physical record describes is a prolonged multi-decadal drought spreading across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin, not uniform, not absolute, but persistent enough to strain every agricultural system it touched. The consequences beyond Egypt were severe. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's most powerful rival and treaty partner for over a century, collapsed with striking speed around 1180 BC. Its capital, Hattusa, in the highlands of modern Turkey, was abandoned and burned. Later, Hittite correspondence, including letters discovered at the ancient site of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, describes urgent requests for grain shipments, citing starvation conditions in the Hittite heartland. Those letters were never answered. Ugarit itself was destroyed around the same time and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace centres of Greece, the civilization behind the legends of Troy and Agamemnon, collapsed in the same general period. Palace economies that had organised Bronze Age Greece for centuries simply ceased to function. Writing disappeared from the archaeological record. Population levels dropped sharply. The late Bronze Age world, the most interconnected network of civilizations the ancient Mediterranean had yet produced, came apart within the span of a few generations. Egypt survived, but not without cost. The reign of Ramesses III in the early 12th century BC was dominated by a series of military confrontations with groups Egyptian records collectively call the Sea Peoples, migrating populations arriving by land and sea from the north and west, pressing against Egypt's borders in waves of unusual scale and persistence. Modern scholarship has moved away from treating these migrations as simple invasions. The populations involved appear to have included communities displaced by the same drought conditions that were destabilising their home regions. Agricultural failures, pushing entire groups into movement, climate refugees, in the contemporary sense of the term, pressing against a civilization that was itself under environmental strain. Ramesses III repelled these incursions. Temple reliefs at Medinet Habu record the battles in elaborate detail. But the administrative records from the same period document something the reliefs do not celebrate: grain shortages, delayed rations, and a state visibly straining to meet its obligations while fighting on multiple fronts. Military victory and institutional stability are not the same thing. Even empires built on gold cannot eat stone. In the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, a group of workers set down their tools and walked off the job. They did not revolt. They did not riot. They did not march on the capital or make demands of the pharaoh directly. They simply stopped working and then crossed the boundary wall of their worksite to sit outside it, in protest, until someone in authority came to explain where their food was. That someone eventually came. The explanation was not satisfying. The food arrived late, short, and would continue to arrive that way. The workers went back, but nothing was the same. The village of Deir el-Medina sat on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, tucked into a dry desert valley behind the cliffs that sheltered the Valley of the Kings. Its residents were not ordinary labourers. They were the craftsmen and artisans tasked with cutting and decorating the royal tombs, a specialised literate community whose work was considered sacred enough to warrant state provisioning. Their grain, fish, oil, and clothing were supplied directly by the royal administration on a fixed schedule. When that schedule failed in around 1159 BC, the workers did something that had never been formally recorded before in human history. They went on strike. The event is preserved in administrative papyri recovered from the site, practical documents recording the work stoppage, the negotiations, the partial resolutions, and the resumption of labour. Our scribes wrote down what happened not as history, but as bureaucratic record. The very ordinariness of the documentation makes it more striking, not less. This was not an extraordinary crisis being described in extraordinary language. It was a supply failure being processed through standard administrative channels, which meant it had happened before and would happen again. The papyri from Deir el-Medina across this period paint a picture of a system under sustained pressure. Ration deliveries were delayed not once but repeatedly across months and across multiple years. Officials responsible for provisioning the workforce cited shortfalls they attributed to administrative difficulties. Researchers examining the broader context point to something more structural. The grain simply was not there in the quantities needed to meet all of the state's obligations simultaneously. So, temple inscriptions from this era reference low Nile levels in language that carries an undertone of anxiety absent from earlier records. The administrative correspondence grows increasingly concerned with logistics, substitutions, and deferred payments. Simultaneously, records from within the royal court itself document a different kind of rot. A conspiracy against Ramesses III, the so-called Harem conspiracy, was prosecuted in the final years of his reign. Administrative corruption among officials responsible for supply distribution appears in legal papyri. Institutions under resource stress do not only become less effective, they become less honest. Ramesses III died, probably around 1155 BC, leaving behind a throne that would change hands 9 times in the following century, each ruler named Ramesses, each presiding over a slightly diminished inheritance. The pattern is recognizable. Environmental stress weakening agricultural output, agricultural stress straining state finances, financial strain degrading institutional reliability, institutional failure eroding the political legitimacy that held the system together. It was not identical to the Old Kingdom's collapse. The scale was different, the speed was different, and Egypt did not fragment as completely. But the mechanism was the same one that had operated 1,000 years earlier. The state's ability to feed its people was fraying, and a state that cannot feed the workers cutting its pharaoh's tomb has reached the edge of something it cannot easily walk back from. The system was not broken yet, but the cracks ran all the way through. Egypt did not fall in one dramatic moment. There was no single battle, no decisive invasion, no morning when the civilization simply ceased. What the full record shows, or of course across geology, archaeology, administrative papyri, and isotope chemistry, is something more unsettling than sudden collapse. It shows a civilization that nearly fell, repeatedly, and survived each time by a margin that history has quietly understated. The pattern, traced from beginning to end, is consistent. The 4.2 kilo-year event arrived around 2200 BC and compressed consecutive years of reduced Nile inundation into a span that outlasted every grain reserve the Old Kingdom had built. The result was not merely famine, it was the dissolution of the political and theological architecture that had organised Egyptian society for 5 centuries. The first intermediate period that followed was not a transition. It was a 150-year demonstration of what Egypt looked like without the surplus that held it together. The Middle Kingdom rebuilt more carefully, more deliberately, with infrastructure and institutional memory that the Old Kingdom had never needed to develop. And for several centuries that resilience held. Then the late Bronze Age drought of around 1200 BC spread across the eastern Mediterranean, displacing populations, collapsing neighbouring empires, and placing Egypt's new kingdom under simultaneous military and agricultural strain. The administrative records of Ramesses III's final years and the century of weakening that followed show the same sequence playing out again. Environmental stress translating into resource shortfall into institutional failure into political fragmentation. Different century, different dynasty, the same river, the same vulnerability. Modern climate science has made the mechanism legible in ways no ancient Egyptian scribe could have articulated. Researchers reconstructing Nile flood variability across millennia have identified a consistent driver. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, the same Pacific climate system that influences rainfall patterns across much of the globe today. In years when El Niño conditions strengthen, East African monsoon rainfall weakens. The Blue Nile carries less water northward. The Egyptian inundation falls short. This is not a rare or extreme condition, and it is a recurring feature of the climate system, predictable in type, if not in timing. What made it catastrophic for Egypt was not its novelty, but its duration. Single week flood years were manageable. Multi-year sequences, driven by sustained atmospheric shifts, were not. The monsoon system that fed the Ethiopian highlands was itself sensitive to broader global forcing, orbital cycles, ocean temperature patterns, atmospheric circulation changes that operated across decades and centuries. Egypt sat at the downstream end of a chain of climate dependencies stretching across an entire hemisphere. Every link in that chain was beyond its knowledge and beyond its control. Imagine the Nile at dusk, low, quiet, narrower than it should be. The fields on either bank are dry. The basin walls that should be holding floodwater hold only cracked earth. In the granaries behind the village, the calculations are being done again. How much remains? How many mouths? How many weeks? A civilization waits. Not for armies, not for revolution, for rain, falling somewhere beyond the southern horizon, in highlands no Egyptian farmer has ever seen, feeding a river that will either arrive in time or will not. That waiting is the true texture of ancient Egyptian life, not the gold, not the monuments, not the ceremony, the waiting. Egypt survived because each time the climate eventually stabilized, the monsoons returned, the floods recovered, the margin held, barely, but it held. Had the drought endured a few decades longer, history might remember the pyramids as monuments to a civilization that vanished.